like to start by just thanking you for your presence, the offering that you give by showing up every night or every week to participate in this growing Sangha, and also to ask for your help. If you are able to donate to help these teachings continue, please consider doing so. And thank you for those that are doing so regularly. And as always, would like to emphasize your participation first and foremost, regardless of the financial situation. So thank you for being here. This evening, I'm going to be talking about something that rose between Sokuzan and I a number of months ago. And it came out of a question he asked Unyo and I responded to him that everything is appropriate. And he's brought that up in a few of his Dharma talks recently. And so I thought it might be something I could explore a little bit. And there are a lot of directions that we can go with that. So even for just a moment to reflect on somewhat of an absurd statement, relatively, everything is appropriate. And to just start by clarifying, this is not a call to pacifism, apathy, or indifference, bypass anything. In a sense, it's more of a call to intimacy with our world as it is arising. And sometimes, for me at least, when I hear teachings, I try to apply them in a very external way. That I try to understand the teachings. And so it's easy with something like this, that everything is appropriate, to try to take some artificial objectivity, an artificial aloofness, an artificial dissociation, so that we can begin to see how appropriate the world is as it arises. But the appropriateness of the confusion that arises in the world is no more or less appropriate than the confusion that arises within our own mind stream. So the realistic place to start is not so much trying to understand how the world is appropriate in all of its chaos and all of its expressions and gestures of violence and hatred and bigotry, but to see how much say-so we actually have over the thoughts that arise in the mind stream, the causes and conditions that arose and continue to arise as any individual. And the reason that situation is appropriate is not because it's validated by external standards. If anything, you could say that the causes and conditions that arise are self-validated. It is appropriate in the sense that it is arising. Now, we can take an attitude of idealism, which would say it's only appropriate once I've refined it to align with the precepts. It's only appropriate once I have refined it to align itself with the doctrine of Buddhism. But Buddhism is a much messier path than that. Buddhism has to work with the realism of the messiness of samsara, of the chaos, the difficulty, the first noble truth of suffering, dukkha. And when I said to Sokuzan, everything is appropriate, I actually don't know what I was saying. I can't say that there was anything other than he sometimes asks for really quick responses. So the first thing that comes up, comes out. But then to reflect on it, what does that mean? To say meditation is the prime seat of appropriateness. That we have this container, strong container with almost no demand, and I would say perhaps no demand. But it's a container where everything is appropriate. If you listen to meditation instruction from Sokuzan or from the lineages throughout history, not unique, this isn't a new form of meditation, even outside of the Zen tradition. That meditation is an encouragement to see that everything is appropriate. And how do we do that? By endeavoring to place no demands on what arises spontaneously. That if something arises in the context of meditation, something like a haunting, something angelic, something mundane, something fast or slow, our meditation practice is neither supported nor inhibited by those movements, because those movements are appropriate as they are. And our practice is to not do anything other than intend to receive that, intend to observe that. In a sense, I feel that this is what the whole of the teachings is pointing at, not just in meditation, although that's the container, that's the example, you could say the microcosm for our world. That when we get up off of the cushion and we relate to the world, there are unseen biases and standards and prejudice, which we overlay on our world that makes it sometimes more bearable. But it's a type of rejection where we don't recognize that when something arises, it's appropriate. It is, again, not to say that we would not function in a way to dissuade it, modify it, but that doesn't come out of a standard. It also comes out of the appropriateness of the causes and conditions that are arising at any given moment. And I think, at least for me, this is perhaps one of the most difficult areas to relate to, because it's somewhat easy to work with the concept if I objectify the world. It's much more difficult when I try to relate to the world with the chaos that's still arising and endeavoring to offer myself the same kindness, that my inclinations towards any one of the five afflictions, passion, aggression, prejudice, pride, and jealousy. Those are the five afflictions, often reduced down to the three poisons: passion, aggression, and ignorance. But it's very difficult to see it, to begin to have a glimpse of our neurotic mind, and then begin to see how helpless we are. And to see that that is the appropriate gesture that arises out of causes and conditions. And I don't think that that is apathy or a negation of the power it is to be embodied. But it's the incredible recognition of how much is going into any given expression, and the minute part we can see and the minute part that we can actually have a say-so over. SokukoJi gave a talk in Kalamazoo on Monday, and for those of you that were there, his gesture of control was he got up and he walked out over and looked out the window for a few moments, and then he sat back down. And it may look like a lot of control, but it's not. And we notice that when our intense emotions begin to arise, we can't just walk away from them. Maybe you can a little bit. So I wanted to share one thing that comes out of, as all of you maybe you know or don't know, I have a really, really strong connection, or I feel really inspired by early Chinese Buddhist Zen masters in the Tang Dynasty. And this would be like the 6th or 7th century up until maybe like the 9th or 10th century. And one of the earliest ones, his name was Guishan. Guishan comes from the rich lineage of Huineng and a master named Matsu and Baizhang and Huangpo came after him. But these really profound masters, and his teachings were really empowered to me by the interactions he had with his Dharma successor, whose name was Yangshan. And they had a lot of really wonderful exchanges. And so this is one of those exchanges. So Guishan, the master, asked Yangshan, of the 40 scrolls of the Nirvana scripture, how many are Buddha's talk and how many are the devil's talk? Yangshan replied, they're all devil's talk. Guishan said, hereafter no one will be able to do anything to you. Yangshan asked, and this is where he got himself in trouble, as a temporary event, where do I focus my action? Guishan said, I just want your perception to be correct. I don't tell you how to act. And of the 6 months 8 months I spent studying these 5 houses, that is two of the most powerful teachings that resonated with me. This grand master, the founder of the first house of Zen, there's 5 houses of Zen, the founder of the first house of Zen that had such a huge impact on the teachings and the way they were presented, they actually recognized it. Still Zen, all the houses of Zen are still Zen, but his style was so unique. And for him to say to his student, I don't tell you how to act, just see clearly, really speaks to how everything is appropriate, because you can't discriminate activity. You can't give a response. In regards to a temporary event, how do I act? There's no prescription. But Chiezan says, if you can see clearly, you can function out of your intelligence, the action takes care of itself. Everything is appropriate. The situation takes care of itself. Even our confusion and the way we get tangled up in samsara is appropriate. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to train our minds, because it's appropriate to be in samsara. It's appropriate. It's not a wrong thing to do. It's also appropriate to see clearly if we have the inspiration, if we have the intention, if we have the good fortune to hear the teachings. And I think part of why I come back to these early masters is because Buddhism has a history of becoming hyper-institutionalized, that we begin to identify ourselves as Buddhists, which is appropriate and helpful. It gives us a container, but we identify with a religion to the extent that we use it as a barrier. We relate to the world as Buddhists. We relate to the world as meditators. And that is one layer between us and actually relating to the world. And so these early Zen masters were not really interested in these institutions. And the emphasis was so heavily placed on practice. And that's something that's very rare. I think that we were lucky, and I think that Buddhism, as it came to America, had a real revitalization. Some people think that it's lost authenticity because it doesn't replicate the language and the culture and the forms. But I feel that it had a returning to the essence. I think Sokuzan's teachers were endeavoring to connect students with practice. Seems like Trungpa Rinpoche, Sokuzan talks about seminary. I think he said they were sitting like 12 hours a day or something, 10 hours or 12 hours a day. Kobun Chino Roshi emphasizing practice, Shunryu Suzuki Roshi emphasizing practice. And I've been reading about a few more contemporary teachers. The one that I have brought up this afternoon was a great Zen master named Kodo Sawaki Roshi, also known as Homeless Kodo or Wandering Kodo. Is Kodo here tonight? Different Kodo. But he he had this very funny, I think this is hysterical, very different attitude. He was raised in the red light district. He was beaten. He was helping with gambling dens at a young age. He ran away to Eiheiji and asked to join. Well, you can't go to Eiheiji unless you have a master that ordained you. And he said, I'm starving to death. If I leave, I don't have enough food. And so the monk said, well, I'll give you some rice porridge and be on your way. And he said, in that case, I don't need any food. And he sat there for 2 days and was ordained eventually and went on. But at some point in his life, he was offered the abbotship of Eiheiji. I don't know why this is hysterical to me. He was offered to be the abbot of the most prestigious Soto Zen institution. And he said only a dog would take that position. And he had become so disenchanted with the hyper ritualization, the hyper forms and standards, the prejudice, the elitism, that he said only a dog would take that position. And they called him homeless. Yes.
What year was it?
He was born in 1880. And I don't know. I have to imagine he was part of the Russo-Japanese War in the early 1900s. And my guess would be maybe in the 30s or 40s, but I don't know. But the homeless Kodo part was he also recognized the politics involved. We see it here, the politics involved in authority. He said, I want no part of it. I will not call any temple home, because that was a very important part of succession and prestige, and the temple that oversaw other temples. And he just had his students sit and sit and sit and sit. And when they went into sesshin, it was 14 hours a day of sitting, meals on the cushion, no samu, no talking, no teachings, no interviews, 14 hours a day of just meditation practice. But bring it back to everything is appropriate. That teaching is, in essence, really meaningless. It really is meaningless, because you can't just see the world as appropriate. We need this container of sitting down and seeing how inappropriate we think our minds are, how inappropriate we think our world is, how inappropriate we think our relations are. And so we have to have a starting point. We can't just replicate a concept. And as I said at the beginning, it's a messy practice. It's a messy practice because if everything is appropriate, you're not going to shut out anything, or you'll see the way in which you shut out. So I know I tend to maybe hold forth a little too long, so I would see if there's any questions from anybody. Mozuku?
Mozuku bowing. With the story of Wandering Kodo, the way you're telling it, it sounds like he didn't want to participate in the politics of was that ignorance, that or avoidance, or
I could never speak on his behalf, but I think there was a profound insight. And I think that if we look at, I really like to look at the transition of Buddhism into new countries. So like Bodhidharma is a good example. He brought into a situation where the sutras and the precepts and moral conduct was very heavily emphasized. So most Buddhist monasteries at the time were more scholastic. And he brought it back to the essence. What did the Buddha do? The Buddha sat down under the Bodhi tree. If you look at Dogen, I think he had a similar disenchantment with what was happening in Japan, and that he wanted to get back to the essence. And so he brought back the practice of shikantaza, of sitting. If you read about Suzuki Roshi, he was incredibly disappointed of the state of Zen in Japan. I think Kobun had a similar situation. Trungpa is a bit different because he was expelled from his country, but I think there are a lot of teachers that talked about how the institutionalization in Tibet had even gotten to a point where the teachings were being lost in power struggles. So I don't think that Kodo Sawaki Roshi was ignoring something. I think he was recognizing that the essence of what the Buddha taught to train one's mind to see clearly was being lost in the maintenance of culture and ceremony. I don't think we have to follow his example in the sense of doing away with all ceremony. But I do think that we do a good job, that Sokuzan does a good job, that his primary teaching is train the mind. It's not sending all of the monks out to Ryumonji or Tassajara or Eheji just so that they can perform ceremonies. I think Trungpa Rinpoche actually acknowledges that the very first paragraph of the Sadhana of Mahamudra, he says that monks go around performing little ceremonies for material gain and to draw people together socially. As a result, the spiritual energy is being lost, something like that.
Mozuku bowing. With what you're teaching, with everything's appropriate, if that includes a power struggle, what is a response that comes out of seeing that a power struggle's appropriate?
If you're having to respond, my understanding would be you're not seeing the appropriateness of it. You're still looking at it and then using that to validate or justify the next thing to occur. I don't think that we can help but do that. I think that that's something I do. It's like a strategy we're looking at. We're trying to find the least painful way to relate to things, and that's why it's a teaching to look at, not to replicate. So more about that.
Mizuku bowing. I resonate with that story of wandering Kodo because if somebody doesn't want me to lead in an area, I just great, because why would you want to step into that? You've run across this. How do you work with leading if people are objecting or having difficulty with your leading? What is leadership in a sangha?
For me right now, it's the direction of the teacher. It's very, very painful, and yet it's probably the most comfortable position I can know, because right now I can just kind of defer, which I endeavor to do as much as possible back to Sokuzan. It doesn't always make sense, but I think that the nice thing right now is I don't have to have some sort of authority to function. The container helps guide that functioning. My responsibility, even in the context of having been asked to be a Dharma teacher or empowered to be a Dharma teacher, is to train my mind to use these forms, just as any one of us uses these forms, to look at the way in which the mind continues to get caught up. So it seems to me that for now, it's always about training, and that's not to say that sometimes that's not forgotten. But if we can, we try to return back to that intention to relate to everything as a way of looking at our own minds. Shoro
Bowing. Can that deference to the teacher become not seeing clearly?
can be.
Can we recognize that?
You might. I'm not really sure where you want to go with that. It can be covering up, and I think it's also possible to see that, and it's also possible to hide out in that.
I want to go more into that, but I hoping something will come up. What is the intelligence of the student on the path?
We talked about this a little bit in book study, and there's a type of intelligence that brings us back to meditation that, to me, is the closest I can get to a non-conceptual intelligence, because the traditional type of intelligence would talk us out of meditating at some point to some extent, and yet there's some sort of energy, magnetism, gravity that brings us back over and over, despite the discomfort that is uncovered through meditation. So there's a type of intelligence in practicing, I think, and that intelligence is possible when we have a willingness not to know. And so I said there was 2 teachings out of these 5 houses that really struck me. I mean, there was a lot of them, but the first one is Kuei Shan saying to Yang Shan, I don't tell you how to act, just see clearly. And the other one was Tongshan Lianji, who is the founder of Sao Dong and Soto Zen. It's like our lineage goes back to Tongshan. And his teacher saying to him, not knowing is most intimate. And again, I don't know if I can dissect that for you, but there's something about when you don't know, the intimacy is just the spaciousness. When you don't know, you can be intimate because you're not moving, you're not taking a direction or a position. And so as practitioners, we can endeavor to relate to not knowing, and we can notice when our practice starts to get drawn up into this artificial confidence of accumulated knowledge, accumulated hours on the cushion, accumulated years of being on the path. And I liked, again, coming back to Kodo Soaki Roshi, he said he always practiced as if Dogen were scolding him. And I don't know if I'd go that far, but there's something about that, the humility of the Bodhisattva path, the humility of, I sometimes think of that gesture of prostrating. Sometimes it's taught about like lifting the feet of the Buddha. I also just sometimes imagining lifting the entire world above myself. It's like I put myself in front of everything and put it over me. You know, it's just a way to try to connect with bodhicitta, but yeah, there's something about that that's helpful to remember that the path of the bodhisattva is not elevation and success, it's a path of service.
This, I think it's from John Klein in his book. He uses the phrase like, or it warns about getting stuck in discipleship. I'm wondering, is that something that you see, or that that's even possible?
Well, it's possible. I think some of the things we can work with though is inspiration on the path, which can come from being a student, from being, to use that word, a disciple. It's also easy to regurgitate the teacher's words as your own, to kind of like think you understand how profound they are, and to use that image of the five houses. If anybody wants to read more about that, just look at the way the Zen master Yunmen related his students. He was disgusted if he ever heard them repeating something he said. It's just like he used very graphic and coarse language about them putting stuff in their mouth that didn't belong there. But I think that that's such an intimate situation between a teacher and student, and you have to have, if you ask somebody to be your teacher, you have to have some, at some point, you're probably going to have some trust that if you need to have something modified, that the teacher will provide that for you. Thank you. Jishin.
Jishin bowing. What is the essence in going back to the essence?
I meant it in a pretty relative sense, and I just meant returning to me, the most simple thing the Buddha taught was meditation practice. And every teaching was an elaboration to help us understand what meditation was sitting us down in. So the essence to me of the Buddha's teaching was just the gesture of sitting under the Bodhi tree and then perhaps touching the earth beneath him. Just like Bodhidharma, the basic essence of his teaching was sit down, keep the eyes open, look at the wall. Dogen, to me, the essence of his teaching was meditation instruction for all people, or Zazen instruction for all people. The essence of Sokuzan's teaching, as I understand it, is train the mind. So in the midst of 2,500 years of conceptual elaboration, I sometimes think that all the teachings are just endeavoring to help us understand what meditation embodies or what meditation is pointing at. So that's what I meant by essence, just that ground of our practice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Navid.
Navi bowing. I was wondering, how do you receive boredom in general, and especially when you were in retreat, and that what we can do with boredom? Bowing.
I resonate. Trungpa Rinpoche talked about hot boredom and cool boredom. I don't know if you've come across that. And hot boredom has like an anxiety. That's the kind of boredom that's like almost intolerable. So we like fidget, or we go for a walk, or we watch TV. And then cool boredom, it's kind of just it's not necessarily comfortable, but it's very spacious. It's not needing much entertainment. And so both of those arise in retreat. And to me, it's a matter of just coming back to the intention of receiving the boredom, receiving the anxiety. Sometimes I get up, or sometimes I enjoy the boredom. Like my body just becomes very comfortable and you sit there. But as far as doing anything else with it, Sokuzan used to talk about boredom as we're finally not entertaining ourselves. And in that sense, that's a pretty wonderful situation to be in. You're actually just in the spaciousness And we're just not used to not having a constant barrage of entertainment. So if we can hold our seat in the boredom, I think that over time we have more of a willingness to just be there, whether there's entertainment or not. And I wish I could recall what text Trungpa Rinpoche talked about boredom. Does anybody know which one someone could read about that in? It's out there. He has a lot of indexes, and you could look in the index of the books for boredom.
Thank you.
Thank you, Navid. Are there any further questions? Yoka.
Milk bowing. Some questions from YouTube. Martine asks, I have seen on stream that during chanting monks put folded clothes on their heads. What is that all about? I hope this is not an inappropriate question.
That's a wonderful question, Martine. So those in the Zendo or online who have either received Jukai or ordination may put a raksu, folded up raksu on their head, this small cloth. Or if they've received monastic ordination, the yokesa, which is larger, it wraps around the body. And then they bring their hands into gasho. And this is something that Dogen, if you read about his trip to China, was moved to tears by, coming into the monastery and seeing all these monks place their robes on their head and recite the robe chant or the robe verse, which essentially you recite it 3 times. We do it once in Japanese, once in English, and again in Japanese. And essentially is just reaffirming or retaking the vow to be with all things or to serve others. So it's just a formal way to enter into our practice.
Milk bowing. And a question from Eric in Barcelona. How much influence did Kodo have on Kobun's approach to cultural forms?
I know they met. I know that Kobun considered Kodo Sawaki Roshi a teacher. I don't have a lot of the history of to what extent. I know Suzuki Roshi referred to him of one of only 6 people he ever met that he considered an enlightened master. And his Dharma heir Uchiyama was a famous teacher, and in the United States to this day, Shohaku Okamura, also considered, I think, Kodo a teacher or in that lineage, and maybe Uchiyama was his preceptor, has influenced all branches or many of the branches of Zen that exist in the United States through Suzuki, Kobun, and Okamura. Probably others, I would guess. He was very well known and received in the 19th and 20th century. Ozuku?
Ozuku bowing. With the teaching you referenced of, I don't tell you how to act, just see clearly, I think it is, or
That's a paraphrase.
sorry.
Yeah, no, that was my paraphrase. You are quoting me correctly. He said, I just want your perception to be correct. I don't tell you how to act.
Ozuku bowing, what comes up for me with that is that if my perception were correct, I might act less confused. Does that imply that action is different if we see what's happening clearly?
I don't know. I don't know that it necessarily does, but it seems that the action wouldn't be at the exclusion of the rest of the situation. This is an area, again, I'm looking at myself because I've related to the teachings for so long with this sense of objectivity of trying to see it in the world while maintaining some sort of artificial groundedness. And it's been very difficult or painful to see the way in which the very causes and conditions I'm trying to be respectful of that are arising in the world, I've disrespected by trying to maintain them within myself. And so I think that, to your question, the activity would probably be more inclusive to what is actually happening in the situation, which would have to include the habit energy, the causes and conditions, the neuroses that continue to arise as long as we're embodied. Sokuzan.
Is there, and there's different ways of responding to this, but as far as you know, and your perception, is there any way that this teacher, your teacher, could be wrong or incorrect?
Fundamentally, no. It would be a type of discrimination.
I'm all, am I always right?
Relatively, no.
If you want to leave. Sure.
Other questions?
Jishin bowing.
Go ahead,
Can you please repeat the response from Sokuzan, the last one?
I don't know that I don't know that I can. I apologize. I said my brain is kind of very mushy these days.
I'm sure someone can.
Would anybody like to help string me up? Thank you. Go ahead, Jishin.
Jishin bowing. I also have a question about correct perception. Is it possible to have correct perception without being awakened? Bowing.
I don't know. It seems that the belief in self and other is a pretty disruptive situation to the fluidity of our world. So I guess it may depend on how we're defining correct perception. But if we're talking about Kuei-shan telling Yang-shan to just see clearly, I think that's probably going to be difficult in as long as there's still some attachment to identity.
Thank you.
Shan Yu?
Johnny bowing. How is becoming familiar with the history of Buddhism helpful for my practice? Bowing.
It may or may not be. I think that all of us are drawn to different aspects of the practice. And I know it's just a very subjective situation. I feel pretty magnetized to this particular period of Zen. There's also particular periods of Tibetan Buddhism that I feel pretty connected to, but that's not to say that my practice is somehow advanced in any way from someone who's not really interested. I think that whatever we can do to inspire ourselves to meditate, whatever avenue, whatever area we can look at or relate to, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a teaching, whether it's Sangha, whether it's just our own suffering, that's to me the value. What is it that brings us back to the cushion?
Thank you. So am I missing anything by not knowing all the information back there?
Could you repeat?
Is he missing anything by not knowing all of this information? No, not as far as I understand. Sokuzan didn't ask me to memorize any of this. Maybe others have this too. There are certain parts of the teachings that you couldn't forget if you tried. They resonate in such a way that it's always right there. And there's other parts that no matter how hard I try, they just haven't stuck yet. So I wouldn't look to say you need to know this or not. If you need to know it, you'll know it. Sokuzan used to say at the end of a lot of his talks, forget everything I said. He would say, forget everything I said. And sometimes he'd follow it up with, if you need to remember it, you will, or if you need to know it, you will. But it was kind of like, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Mozuku?
Suzuki bowing. I'm trying to relate to what you were saying about practicing with a sense of objectivity or seeing what's appropriate out there. And can you give an example of that, even if you have to make one up a little?
I can try. Like the idea of respecting people's confusion, we endeavor to apply that in such a way where we try to desensitize ourselves, or we try not to have a response. Like the respect is like almost kind of like a form of stupidity of like, wow, they need to do whatever they do, but all the while we're stuffing down the intensity of how irritating it is. So we're trying to maintain, like, I'm going to be a good practitioner, I'm going to be a good meditator and help them with their confusion, and thinking that in order to do that, we have to be without confusion ourselves, or without negativity, or without whatever abrasiveness is arising.
Sokuko, thank you, that was helpful. How are you working with that?
It's difficult. Like I said, it feels messy. It feels messy because if we can maintain that artificial objectivity, we at least have a little bit of a buffer, but it's hard when we start to see the depth of our own warfare. And so it's difficult. I can say that much. Any other questions, particularly from anyone who's not asked anything tonight?
Yoka bowing. What is appropriate action?
It wouldn't be prescribed action, as I understand it. That I feel like this is exactly what Yangshan asked Kuei-shan in a temporary situation. How should I act? Like when I have to engage in the relative world. So he's acknowledging in a temporary situation, how do you act? And Kuei-shan saying, I can't tell you how to do that. Just see clearly. So I would just refer back to that. I don't know. SokukoJi.
How do you see clearly?
I think that the way I understand it is to see the lack of clarity, to continue to return into, as I understand it, the container in which we can begin to relate to our impulse to label things as inappropriate. So as a fruition, I don't know, as a practice, an insistence on training one's mind. Yoka?
Yoka bowing. What did you just said? Container. What is the container we return to?
Meditation practice.
Yoka bowing. If we're intending to receive, look at our awareness, can anything that comes out of that be inappropriate?
I don't see how it could be, because again, we're not defining appropriate as opposed to inappropriate, where it's a type of vast respect or acknowledgement of things that are arising. It's not to say that confusion might not arise out of that. We might not continue to perpetuate something that is causing harm, but the appropriateness is a respect for the way in which things are arising, and a willingness to relate to them as it arises, as opposed to how we would like them to arise. Thank you. We can stand and dedicate the merit.
Thank you for coming, for attending this Dharma talk. Thank you for all of your help in supporting this community, both by attending, by practicing, and by financially supporting us. We need your help. Please continue if you can.